Okay, so this is one of the research methods questions from a past company exam. It says 20 students in Miss Moffat's Year 12 psychology class take part in her serial position effect experiment. So this is something similar to what we did for the outcome 3 research poster, remember? The class has 2 minutes to memorize a list of 15 words that are read aloud by Miss Moffat. Group 1, which comprises of 10 students, is only allowed to write down any words they remember in any order after they have completed an additional page of math sums, taking approximately 2 minutes to complete, 2 more minutes to complete. So you can see that that's the that's the delayed recall group. Okay, what do we think the delay task in that situation is for group 1? Remember, we did something very similar to this for our class experiment for outcome 3. What is the specific delay task given to group 1 there in the scenario?
The 2 minutes to complete.
Yeah, the 2 minutes to complete the math sum. So that's the delay task. In our experiment, if you remember the one that we did in class, our delay task was actually writing the alphabet backwards for 30 seconds. So either way, both of these tasks take more time than what the time of the short-term memory is. Okay, so that's group 1. And group 1, we can annotate that they are the delayed recall group. Okay, they are only allowed to recall the words after a delay. Delayed recall. And then group 2, which is the remaining 10 students, because remember, we're dealing with 20 students. So the remaining 10 students can write down as many words as they can remember in any order immediately. So that gives you a clue that this is the immediate recall group. Again, another clue that they're the immediate recall group is they're not asked to do any other extra delay task that would otherwise act as a distractor for them. They're just basically allowed to look at the words and then straight away recall them. Okay, so there's 2 conditions, delayed recall and immediate recall. Now the question is, I've just taken the only relevant question I think is really important. So the question B is, draw an appropriately labeled graph of the expected results for group 1 and group 2. Draw a trend line for both groups 1 and 2. Now trend line, what that means is you can draw the curve. Remember when we did serial position effect, we talked about the serial position effect curve that basically follows this kind of a shape. It's kind of like a U shape. Okay, and basically what it indicates is that the words in the middle have a low recall. That's thus they kind of show that dip or that kind of low number. The words at the start of the list show a high level of recall, which is why they're quite high. And the words at the end of the list also show a high level of recall, which is again why they're very high. So that basically indicates the primacy effect. This indicates the recency effect, and this indicates the poor recall for words that are in the middle. Okay, this is the definition of what the serial position effect is. And our serial position effect curve, which is always a U-shaped curve, demonstrates that idea in terms of a graph or a curve. So when it says you draw a trend line for both groups 1 and 2, what it's indicating is you draw a curve for group 1. Now group 1, because they've got delayed recall, does anyone remember what kind of effect is eliminated when we have a delayed recall condition? So when you guys, for example, did the alphabet task in class for 30 seconds, which effect was eliminated? Was it the primacy effect or was it the recency effect?
Recency.
Yeah, the recency effect was eliminated. So obviously these guys in group 1 are not going to have a full curve. Their curve is going to kind of just go halfway, yeah? It's going to start off here and then taper down towards the end. It's not going to go all the way up because these guys, which is group 1, are not going to have a recency effect. Okay, group 2, however, which is the immediate recall condition, will experience the full serial position effect. So they will experience the full serial position effect. But the delayed recall group will experience no recency effect, only a primacy effect there. Okay, that's the main idea. I'll show you guys what that looks like, and I'll show you the solution from the actual exam as well. Okay, that's the basic idea. When it says, when it asks you to draw a trend line, that's what they're asking you to do. Now, usually they don't ask you to draw a trend line. I don't know why this exam has done that, but that shouldn't be anything too confusing. When it says draw an appropriately labeled graph, you might be thinking, oh my God, how am I supposed to do that? They haven't given me any data. Like, remember when we did our experiment in class, we were able to make the graph because we had the data in terms of what percentage of students recalled the word dog, what percentage of students recalled the word frog, or whatever we had in that list. Okay, in this scenario, you notice that there's no actual data. Okay, she hasn't, Miss Muffet's classes frequency of recall in terms of which students and how many students recalled each word is not actually there. So how are we supposed to draw this graph? Well, this is really important for us to remember that when Vika asks us to draw graphs, they don't always expect you to put actual numbers on the y-axis, particularly if they haven't given you that data. You can make those numbers up if you want, but usually they don't deduct marks if they haven't given you the data, because if you don't have the actual data, how are you going to actually put numbers on that y-axis, like actual percentages of recall, like 20, 30, 40, like that? Okay, so sometimes they don't expect you to put the numbers there, okay? And that's particularly the case if they haven't given you the actual data. And the two VCA examples that we'll look at today, I'll explain that further. They haven't given the data there either, okay? Anyway, I'll show you guys a suggested answer. I'll show you all the answers, actually, the ones from the company exam and an ugly one that I also drew up. This is the one from the exam, so the actual from the solutions of the exam. You'll notice that looks like, that does your head in, basically. Again, this answer is showing you the two possible ways you could have attempted this. You could have just attempted this question by drawing the serial position curves, which you can see here. Okay, you can see if I can kind of outline over that. Okay, I can't really go right on top, but you can see a curve kind of happening there. That curve that I've drawn on top of the blue represents the group 1 trend. Okay, and then the curve that I've drawn here, which you can see as a kind of U shape, the red dotted curve. Okay, that is the group 2 trend. Okay, group 2 meaning that these are the immediate recall group who experience the full serial position effect, both recency and primacy, thus the U-shaped curve. And then the other group is the, what's it called? The delayed recall group who only experience the primacy effect, but no recency effect. So you can see the graph kind of tapers down. It doesn't form a U shape. Okay, and there's very low recall for the last few words. Remember, low recall for the last few words means the recency effect was eliminated. Okay, so that's basically one way, the easiest way, in my opinion, and the least time consuming way that you could have done this question and still gotten full marks for it. Okay, if you're more mathematical and you want to take the hard way out, you can actually make your own, make up your own axes. So you can actually put some numbers there on the y-axis, and you can just like make up the figures. So you can draw your bar graph in a way that it does form a U shape, or you can draw a U-shaped curve over it. I wouldn't recommend this because I think it would be too time consuming. But look, if it helps you to draw that U curve better, you can do it. But honestly, I wouldn't waste too much time. So anyway, the extra details about where you get marks are given here. So I'll just underline them. Obviously, it's a graph. So just like I deducted marks for you guys who didn't have proper captions on the graph in the poster, you will also be deducted marks if you don't have proper captions or proper labels. Okay, you need to label the y-axis. You need to label the x-axis. You get 2 marks just for labeling the axes. Okay, so that's one label there you can see, and that's the other label there. Okay, because this experiment is about the serial position effect, the x-axis is always about the position of the word in the list. So whether it's the first word, third word, 14th word, whatever. And the y-axis is always about the percentage of recall or the number of participants who correctly recalled the word. Okay, it's about recall, the frequency of recall there. The third mark is basically for showing the trend line. Now I'll discuss this a little bit, or just for showing a correct graph. Okay, and then for group 1, okay, so for acknowledging one group, if you only draw a graph that represents one group, like you only draw the U-shaped curve, but you don't draw the curve that kind of tapers off towards the end for the delayed recall group, the blue one, you're not going to get full marks because you need to draw the graph for both group 1, which is our delayed recall group, and group 2. Okay, so that's what they basically mean. You get 1 mark for the correct graph for group 2, and 1 mark for the correct graph for group 1. Okay, they've given you some notes here as well, and they said the overall graph label should be the serial position effect, blah, blah. So this is basically like our title of the graph or the caption of the graph. So you can literally just say the effect of primacy and recency effect as a result of delayed and immediate recall, or you can call it anything. Okay, so that's the one the exam solutions have given you. I'll just show you the ugly one that I've also drawn up, which is very ugly, but kind of clearer to actually see because it's a lot bigger. Obviously, you can see I never used a ruler. So couldn't find my ruler when I was doing this last night. So yeah, so that's basically what it looks like. You can see here that the blue colored one is the immediate recall group. Okay, so that's kind of, if I can draw over it again, that's the U-shaped curve. Okay, again, you can see it's just an estimation. It doesn't have to be exact. I put the numbers in there as kind of an estimate, but look, you don't have to put the numbers in there. Okay, I've put it up to 10. Can anyone look at the scenario and tell me, why do you think I stopped at 10 in terms of labeling that y-axis there? Reading what the y-axis represents is the frequency of recall, number of participants who have correct recall. Why did I stop the graph at 10? Why couldn't I go all the way up to like 100?
Is it because there's only 10 students?
Yeah, there's 10 students in each group. So that's why I've stopped at 10. I can't go up to 100 because I don't have 100 students in each group. It's only 10 students in each group. Okay, and remember the y-axis is showing the number of participants. Okay, with correct recall. So what this is saying is that for the first word that was presented in basically in both groups, in fact, let me just get rid of all the scribbles so it's easier to see. In both groups, whether you were in group 1 or group 2, all participants were able to recall the first word correctly. And this was what we saw when we did our experiment as well. Almost everyone recalled the first word correctly, but towards the end, the second, the delayed recall group, which is group 1, who did the math sums for 2 minutes, they have a very low recall of the last word because of the recency effect being eliminated, remember? So no recency effect for group 1, but group 2, who still show the recency effect, have a high level of recall, okay, for the last word. So that's what it's showing you. And both groups, for words in the middle, both groups have poor recall. Okay, and that's one of the features of the serial position effect. Position of the word in the list, that's our x-axis. Where did I get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 up to 15? Because it says that they have to memorize a list of 15 words. Okay, so obviously that's where the 15 comes from. Yeah, that's basically how you draw it up. Look, I didn't do any bar graphs here, and you wouldn't be expected to either. So if you draw something like this, you would get the full 4 marks there. Any questions, guys, about?
Oh, Miss, can we like write it?
Can we write it means, what do you mean?
Like, do we have to do like the graph?
Yes, if they ask you to draw a graph, you must draw a graph. As in, like, when we say graph, guys, I think like look, when we do psychology, we don't do a lot of mathematical graphs. We focus a lot on bar graphs. But when they say graph, if it's about a serial position effect, you can also take into account the serial position effect curve. Okay, that is still a graph that's based on a graph. Okay, you can see here that they drew the curve over the graph. So serial position effect curve is still a type of data that can be drawn as a graph or considered to be a graph. For
So they didn't give them like the numbers though. So do you just use your own numbers to make a curve?
Yeah, more or less. Look, when you're doing your axes, it has to also make sense. For example, if you've only got 10 students in each group, this can't go up to 20. Yeah, that would not be correct because there's not 20 participants in each group. So yeah, it's got to make sense. Use whatever information they've given you to draw the graph. Okay, for example, we've only got 15 words. So if your x-axis goes all the way up to 20, that's wrong because there's not 20 words that are being examined or that are being tested by Miss Moffat. Okay, she's only using 15 words. So as long as you take into account whatever information they have given you, you can make kind of guesstimates with the rest of it in terms of you don't have to be exact because look, they haven't given us much to work with here. So this is all that we can create based on what they've given us. Do we have to add the numbers? Which numbers are you referring to? Numbers on the x-axis or y-axis? Because one of them is negotiable, one of them is non-negotiable. Okay, for this question and similar questions that Vika have asked in the past, the x-axis is compulsory. Okay, we know for sure that Miss Moffat has used 15 words in her word list, so we need to include the numbers on the x-axis. Vika have been kind of like inconsistent in terms of the y-axis. Sometimes they want you to include the numbers on the y-axis, but sometimes they don't. I think if you've got enough information in your scenario to be able to include them, it's always better to do that. But in the past ones that they've done, they've given marks even if students haven't included clear numbers on the y-axis. That doesn't mean, however, that you can't label You still need to label your y-axis because that's a separate mark given for the labeling, and that's a separate mark given for the graph. Okay, so a simple answer to that is x-axis always should be labeled. Y-axis in terms of the scale doesn't need to always be there, but the labeling of both axes need to happen. Labeling means the little label that you give under your graph, under your x and y axis there. Okay, so that's the basic idea. Okay, remember guys, the graph, it's not just the actual graph drawing that gets you the marks. It's like including the label on the x-axis, including the label on the y-axis, including the correct scale. All of those things basically get you the marks. In most cases, for example, in this question, the actual graph part, which I'll circle here, which is actually just drawing the graph, putting the key in, that part is only worth 2 marks. The other 2 marks come from you correctly labeling the y-axis and the x-axis. Okay, so remember that it's
Miss,
yeah?
Did they have this last year in the exam?
No, they didn't have this last year or the year before. The last time that this was in a VCA exam was in 2017. And that was a very, very simple graph, which I'll show you guys very soon. So that was a much, much simpler graph. This is taken from one of the more challenging psychology exams, company exams, not a VCA exam. Okay. All righty. So I think we'll keep moving on. In fact, this is the one from the 2017 VCA psychology exam. So it says for her VCE practical, we don't need to read the whole thing, but I'll just focus on the main kind of points. So it's given for her VCE psychology practical investigation, Jamie decided to investigate the effect of maintenance rehearsal versus elaborative rehearsal on the ability to recall 20 words. The following are extracts from her scientific poster. So she's done a poster and this is some information from it. So she's given the IV memory technique, use DV, the list of 20 words, which doesn't sound right. Anyway, method 2 of 5 year 10 classes at Sundown High School were selected to participate in the investigation. A Monday morning class and a Friday afternoon class were selected to fit with the experimenters' availability, trying to make it easier for the experimenter. So think about what type of sampling might be used there. What type of sampling do we think, guys?
Convenience.
Yeah, convenience, correct. So all of the students voluntarily agreed to participate. So that indicates that voluntary participation as an ethical principle was fulfilled. It was not breached. Class A, okay, Class A is Friday afternoon. Students were told that they would be, so this is kind of like our condition 1, we could say, I suppose, C1. Students were told that they would be shown 20 words and were instructed to remember as many of the words as they could by silently repeating the words over and over. Interesting. Anyone take a guess? Is that maintenance rehearsal or elaborative rehearsal?
Maintenance.
Yep, correct. Because remember we said maintenance is like rote learning, just repeating it over and over again until it gets into your memory there. Each word was presented on the screen for 2 seconds at a time with a 1 second blank screen between each word. The students were then asked to immediately write down as many of the 20 words as they could remember in any order. The following 20 words were shown to the students one at a time in a random order using a data projector. So why they've bolded random order is probably to indicate that, for example, they're not showing words like bun and sun together. They're not showing words like sticks and ticks right next to each other. For example, they say bun, shoe, knee, door. Why do you think that they would want to do that? Why are they showing these words in a random order rather than just showing them in a rhyming order like they do with the next group? Can anyone take a guess as to how doing something like that might affect the results or might prevent?
It's because for elaborative rehearsal, they try to make meanings out of the word.
Yeah.
Like connections, like bun and sun rhyme. So that's how you learn.
Yeah. Yeah, excellent. Good work. So that basically, yeah. So when you look at the word bun and sun, they rhyme and it's easier for you to remember. And that's elaborative rehearsal. With these kids in the maintenance rehearsal group in Class A, we don't want them to have any cue or any kind of help in terms of remembering. We just want them to rely on the simple repetition of words because that's what maintenance rehearsal is. That's why, unlike the participants in Class B, we haven't paired those words together. We haven't paired bun and sun together or shoe and new together. We've separated them out and used a random order rather than a rhyming order. Okay, so bun, shoe, knee, door, hive, sticks, heaven, late. So that those words are shown on the data projector and the students are asked to immediately recall. Okay, there's no delay task there. Now, class B is the second group. That's our condition 2. So it says class B on Monday morning, students were told that they would be shown 10 word pairs, so that's the rhyming word pairs, and were instructed to remember as many of the words as they could by silently repeating the words over and over. But remember, these guys have a little help in terms of the rhyming. So each word pair was presented on the screen for 4 seconds at a time with a 1 second blank screen between each word pair. The students were then asked to immediately write down. So again, immediate recall is also used in this group as well. Write down as many of the words from the 10 pairs as they could remember in any order. The following 10 rhyming numbered word pairs were shown. So it's the same words as group 1, but they've paired them together so that they rhyme. So sign, mine, late gate, heaven, 11. And actually this makes it easier for them to remember. Based on this data, we can probably say that who do we think will have a better recall in this experiment, guys? Class A or class B?
B.
Yeah, class B, okay? Not just because they've been given rhyming words, but because we know from studying the types of rehearsal that elaborative rehearsal often leads to better long-term storage and retrieval of information because you're giving meaning to that information. You're not just blindly repeating it and blindly memorizing it to yourself. So that's why the conclusion of this study is also that elaborative rehearsal procedures produce better recall compared to maintenance rehearsal. In other words, the performance of class B in terms of their memory recall was much better than class A. All right, before we move on to the actual questions, actual VCA questions for this scenario or stimulus material, any questions, guys, about this scenario itself? Yes, Safa, you've raised your hand.
Miss, you know how we're comparing elaborative with maintenance?
Yep.
Let's just say, what was my question? Oh yeah, Miss, you know how right now they're talking about if the more you repeat a word, the more likely you're going to remember it, or or in this case, elaborative is better because you're adding meaning to it.
Yep.
What about if there's a delayed task? Then what would happen?
If there was a delay task, what that would mean is that the students would, in this case, there isn't, yeah, in this scenario. So I don't want to confuse anyone, but if there was a delay task, let's say that they were asked to write down as many of the 20 words as they could remember after a delay, yeah, what would happen is that we would see an elimination of the recency effect. So whatever words the kids have recently read on the screen, which would usually be the last few words here, these would be least likely to be recalled. So we wouldn't really see this being written on many of those student papers there, because if they've done the delay task, whatever words, those last few words that were still fresh in the student's memory would be overcome or would be timed out because of that delay task that they're doing, because now their mind is going to focus on the delay task, and those words that usually stay in short-term memory for about 30 seconds don't have that ability to stay in short-term memory anymore, because you've got to focus your short-term memory onto another task. Now, does that make sense?
Oh, so Miss, whether there's a delay task or not, elaborative would always be better?
Yeah, exactly. Elaborative is always better regardless of other conditions.
All right, done.
Yeah. Alrighty, so if everyone else understands the rest of the scenario and doesn't have any other questions, we can probably just move on to looking at the VCA questions that accompanied this scenario. So I've just pasted the scenario here as well, so we can refer back to it. Okay, is Jane's identification of the dependent variable correct? Justify your response. So if we look back to the scenario here, we can see that she, this is how she identifies the DV.
Isn't ability to recall?
Yes.
Isn't that the DV?
Yes. So list of 20 words. Guys, when we did our research poster, we mentioned the word list. Does anyone remember which section of the research poster we mentioned the list of 15 words, or the PowerPoint containing the 15 words? There was a specific section of our research poster in which we mentioned that.
Was that materials?
Yeah, materials. Excellent. In the method section. Yeah, so we mentioned that within the method section in the materials. So just one second. Okay. So when we're looking at the list of 20 words, this is something that looks more like it could happen in the materials section, but not really the DV. One component or one feature of the DV is that it needs to be able to be measured, okay? So it needs to be measurable, okay? It's something that we need to be able to measure for change. List of 20 words isn't really indicating an ability of the participants. It's just indicating an item or a material. So that's why we would say Jamie's identification of the dependent variable is not correct. So you would say no, that will get you 1 mark. And then you justify your response. So you know, with your justification, it could go many ways. You could say no, because she mentions that it's a list of 20 words, but that's not something that's measurable. Or no, she mentions that it's a list of 20 words, but rather it's the ability of the students to recall the list of 20 words. So as long as you give a correct justification there or a reason, okay, because that's what justify means. It means give a reason, okay, you will get the 2 marks there. Okay, so that's basically, I'll show you the VCA assessment report for this as well. So yeah, the DB would be the ability to recall the 20 words. Yeah. Okay, so that's the 2 marks. I just want to go through this with you guys first before showing you the actual VCA report for it. Okay, the next one we kind of answered when we were going through the scenario, but what was the sampling procedure, guys, for this scenario?
Convenience sampling.
Yes, correct. So whenever it's a sampling procedure, we're talking about the sampling technique that was used or the type of sampling. So is it random sampling? Is it convenient sampling? Is it stratified sampling? Which one is it? In this case, it's kind of obvious that it's convenient simply because it says that those students were selected to fit in with the experimenter's availability. Okay, so that's kind of a clue that we're looking at easy access to these participants, accessibility, okay? So that's why convenient sampling is the best answer there. So all we write in this box here is convenience. Okay, convenience sampling. So that's the 1 mark there. The other 1 mark, because you notice this question is out of 2, the other 1 mark comes from you discussing a limitation of convenient sampling. Can anyone remember from the top of their head, what's one limitation or weakness or disadvantage associated with convenient sampling?
Can't relate it back to the wider population.
Yeah, we can't relate or we can't generalize the results back to the wider population. Yeah, so that's kind of the key word there. So we can't generalize results. And the reason we can't generalize results is because convenient sampling uses a biased form of sampling or a non-representative form of sampling, which in simple words means that not every person had an equal chance of being selected. So Jane was just like, okay, who fits in with my availability? Yep, you're allowed to be in my experiment. But she didn't give everyone a chance to actually be, to have a chance to take part. So you can't generalize results back to the population is the main limitation that we always talk about. Okay, can't generalize results back to population. Okay. Okay, and then part C of this question is identify an alternative or other sampling procedure that Jane could have used to improve the validity of her conclusion, justify your response. So we've talked about the sampling procedure that she did use currently. Now you've got to identify another alternative sampling procedure. So what alternative sampling procedure would be best for
Random sampling?
Yeah, random sampling. So you just write random sampling and that gives you the 1 mark already. And remember, it's out of 2 marks. So you get 1 mark for identifying the type of sampling procedure and then another 1 mark for justifying or explaining how that would help to improve these issues. So why would random sampling be better, guys, compared to convenience?
Because
Yeah.
people have equal chances to be selected.
Yeah, exactly. It allows for a more representative, so a sample. So you can write because it allows for a more representative sample, and yeah, because everyone has an equal chance of being selected. As everyone in the
Miss?
Yep.
Can you update the answers for the trial exam you gave us? Because I finished it. I just want to check my answers.
Which one was it? Was it the unit 3?
The ACE one, I think. Was it called ACE?
I think
Yeah.
have I put them? No. Okay, I'll put them on school box or I'll email them to you afterwards.
All right, thank you.
No stress. Okay, so because it allows for a more representative sample, as everyone in the population has an equal chance of being selected. That's it. That's your other 1 mark there for you. So you got 2 marks there for that answer. Okay, any issues, guys, with any of these questions that we've looked at? These are not graph questions, but these are the questions leading up to the graph question. All good? Okay, so let's move on, and I'll show you guys what the assessors VCA assessment reports kind of said for each question. So we've done this question, is James' identification of the dependent variable correct? So the average mark across the state for this question was 1.5. So you can see that most people got full marks for this question, but not everyone, okay? And it's mainly for the reasons that we said. So the sample answer is here. No, because the DV must provide a measurable effect of the IV, blah, 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 whereas the list of 20 words is just the material. So you can see that it's very similar to the answers that we kind of came up with in the previous slide. Okay, so that's the basic idea, and they often give you extra information as well. This is why it's good to read the VCA assessors reports, because you can see, you can basically get an idea of what the answers were, and some advice from the actual VCA head examiners there. Could you explain the concept of reliability? And yes, so reliability is about the consistency of results. And when we talk about reliability, we're talking about how consistent the results are. So if Jane was to redo her study again with another set of school students, she would expect to get consistent results. Okay, or she would expect to get very similar results as the first study that she did. We say that reliability is underlined by 3 concepts. Remember, we said CDs is the memory tip that we use for it. Okay, so just like you'd always want to have reliable CDs that don't jump or that don't, you know, play in a weird way. Reliability of results is about also having the CDs, or consistency, dependability, and stability. Your results are consistent, dependable, and stable over time. Okay, for example, if the average recall in James' study of the words was, I don't know, 72% for group 1, if she does another study with another group of students in a different school, she wouldn't want the average recall to drop down to 42%. That's a big jump, okay, which doesn't show reliability because there's no similarity between the results across different contexts or across different trials. What that means is that the results don't have to be exactly equal, but they have to be more or less the same. So if in her first school that she does the study in, the group 1 participants have an average recall of 72%, when she goes into another school in another context, she would want it to be kind of similar. So maybe like something like 65% or 76%, something in that range, not too deviating too far from that actual average that she originally had. So that's what reliability of results mean. It means that each time you conduct a study, you would want that study to generate similar results to the previous time. Validity is more about whether something measures what it's supposed to measure. So for example, for weight loss, if you don't have a scale that's correct, that's showing you the correct number of kilograms, there's no point of using that. That's an invalid tool. So validity is more to do with the actual materials and measures that you're using in a study, like the tools. So that's basically what it is, okay? If we're using, for example, in this case, in James' case, she's using a projector to measure the, to represent the words. She's asking the students to write the words on a piece of paper. If some students are using pieces of paper that have clues on them, then she's not using a valid measurement there, because those students could cheat. Those students could get clues and could write more words than some other students. And then the ability to recall becomes a confounding variable, because some students have cheated, some students have not. So that's why remember when we did our study, guys, I gave you guys a specific word recall sheet. I didn't say, oh, rip a piece of paper out from your exercise book, because when I do that, I do open up a can of worms, in the sense that I open up opportunities for cheating. I open up opportunities for you guys to maybe have clues. So maybe one of the words on our projector was something like, let's say cat. Okay, if your exercise book has a picture of a cat on the front, and I ask you to write your word recall in the exercise book, then obviously when you see that picture of the cat, that acts as a retrieval cue. So that's why, rather than asking you to write your words in the exercise book, I gave you a separate piece of paper, which was word recall sheet. And I only asked you to write your words on that sheet, which I then collected for both conditions. So that is to ensure validity, to ensure that the variable that I'm trying to measure, which is the memory of the words, measures what it is supposed to measure without any kind of outside influence or outside effects. Okay, that's the difference between validity and reliability. Okay, so that's basically the VCA assessors report for part A. So if we look at part B, that's the assessors report. So again, 1.4 out of 2. So the scenario describes convenient sampling. Convenient sampling was the only response that was accepted. There's no other answers that could be accepted for this scenario. And this is something I mentioned to you guys I think from last year itself. I was screaming about this when you guys were in, doing 1 and 2. This idea of convenient sampling. It's not convenient, it's convenience, and ENCE. Be really careful with this. Look, VCA have been saying this literally from the start of time. And even in 2017, they put this in the report because this is still a mistake that students are making. This is another reason why I ask you guys to read the assessors reports, because VCA sometimes mistakes that continue to happen or patterns of error that continue to happen across years, they always they always advise the students not to make that mistake again. So always read the assessors reports when you're doing your VCA exams. So convenient sampling is incorrect terminology. If you wrote convenient rather than convenience, even though your assessor knows what you're trying to mean, you cannot get marks for that. That is a 0. Okay, so you have to be really careful there to write ENCE, not ENT. Yeah, and then there are acceptable responses in terms of the limitation. So we talked about the inability to generalize results to the population. You could even say that the sample was not representative, and so it might be a biased sample there. Okay, so that's the basic idea. So that's the VCA assessors report for that. And then for part C, it says identify an alternative sampling procedure. So you can see basically what VCA expected here was random sampling. And these are all the possible answers and justifications that are possible. Okay, so I think the one that we talked about was that random sampling, this first one here, that random sampling would allow for a more representative sample. Okay, because everyone has an equal chance to be selected, but there are others as well here that you could have talked about. Okay. So that's basically, yeah, that's that question there. And it had an average of 1.4 out of 2. So you can see a lot of students did get full marks for this question, but some students did not. Okay, it might have been because they identified, for example, students who got 1 mark might have identified random sampling, but may not have known how to give the justification or the reason there. So just try your best. It's not that hard to give the reason. You just need to think about it a bit. And you don't have to go into a lot of detail. If they've given you a little bit of space there and it's only worth 2 marks, just give a brief justification and move on. Don't waste all your time on one single question. Okay, moving on now to the graph. This is the graph component, and you can see it's only worth 2 marks. Okay, now what they ask you is they said, using the axes provided below, draw a graph of the likely results for the group of students who used maintenance rehearsal to learn the list of 20 words and label the axes appropriately. So they've again specified that you have to label what's on the x-axis and label what's on the y-axis there. Okay, again, you notice in this scenario, even though it's a huge scenario and it's got a lot of information in it, it doesn't have any actual data in terms of what was the percentage of students who had recall for the first few words in group 1 in class A compared to class B. There's no actual data there. We've just got this conclusion that yet people in class B recalled higher words or recalled better words, had better recall or higher recall compared to people in class A. That's the only thing we know. And for that reason, that's the only thing that we can work with. This idea that people in class B had higher recall than people in class A. So that's the only thing that we've got to work with now as we approach the drawing of this graph. Look, with this graph, there are multiple ways you could have done this according to VCA. Different students come into the exam with different mathematical knowledge. Some students bring in their knowledge from other subjects like further maths. You're not expected to go full mathematical on this question, okay? Whatever graph is easiest for you to draw that we have covered in psychology, such as a bar graph is a simple one, or a line graph, you can use that to draw this. Yeah.
Miss, I have a question.
Yep.
For the x-axis, do we list like 20 words, right?
Yes.
And then what would be a y-axis?
Oh, no. For the x-axis, no, this is not a serial position effect graph. So we're not listing the 20 words. If we look at the IV here, the IV is what we put on the x-axis, yeah? Whatever the IV in your experiment is, that's always the x-axis. Whatever the DV is, that's always the y-axis. Yep.
So you just have maintenance rehearsal and elaborative on the x-axis?
Yeah, in this case, guys, we don't even need to include it. We can, that was one of the options, but you don't even need to, because look, it says for the group of students who use maintenance rehearsal to learn the list of 20 words, it's only asking us really to draw a graph for class A. It's not even asking us to draw a graph for class B. So what you're going to have here, if we're really looking at this simply, is a single bar graph, just one single bar for class A showing their recall. That's about it. You can draw both classes as well. So you could have one for class A and one for class B, but this wasn't necessary to get the full marks. This was one approach that the students used this that year, which was indicated in the assessor's report. So some students draw two graphs, and one of them was like, so for example, I told you guys that class B had a higher recall, yeah? So some of the students, what they did is they drew class B's percentage of recall. So I'm just gonna do a really rough labeling there. So percentage recall as being lower than class A. So something like that, okay? And as long as you labeled, so memory technique, and you have to indicate which one each group used. So this was maintenance condition, and then class B was elaborative. Maintenance, and then this is elaborative rehearsal. As long as you correctly labeled this and you correctly labeled what type of rehearsal each group was having.
That was how do I know the number?
Which
like
number?
How much? Like
you don't
class.
know the number. You don't know the number. We only know that class B, remember in the conclusion, it says elaborative rehearsal procedures, which were only used by class B, right? Produce better recall. This is the word that we're using.
So we just have higher, like,
yeah. So you're just making an estimate. See, when I draw the graph, I can see here from the graph that class B does have higher recall, yeah, compared to class A. So that elaborative rehearsal procedures do lead to higher recall compared to maintenance. That's what I can see from my graph, yeah.
All that for this.
Yep.
all that for this.
Yes.
Like all that writing for this.
Yes, I know. It's just literally, you're just looking at one bit of that scenario and making a graph out of it. But you don't need to include numbers here. The reason we can't include numbers here, guys, is because we don't have actual percentage recall given to us. We don't have that data. This is the only assertion that we can make given the information that we have. So if you drew something like this, you would get the 2 marks automatically. Okay, there are also other things that you can do. I'll show you what the single bar graph would have looked like, and you're going to laugh. That's even more ridiculous. But this is what most of the students did that year. If I can move on to the next page. Okay, most of the students in this year did this, okay, which is class A. Okay, just a single bar graph, just with one bar showing just for class A what kind of recall they had. Okay, you don't even have to label this, just ignore the labeling there. You could have just wrote a number of words recalled, and obviously the taller the bar graph is there shows that the kids in class, that should say class, yeah, class A shows that they have a recall there. You can also draw a serial position effect curve, okay, but this is a more difficult way to approach the question in my opinion, but if it makes more sense to you, then you could look. These are just the 3 first kind of straightforward ways that the ICA talk about. This assessor's report for this question is so long. They talk about scatter plots. They talk about other mathematical ways their students represented it. Any valid graphical interpretation of the data was accepted, whether that's a bar graph, a line graph, a serial position curve. It was basically all accepted there. Okay.
But Miss,
yeah.
Isn't that single bar graph too high? Because you said elaborative was better.
Yeah, but if you look at this, this is where it gets a bit confusing. So number of words recalled out of 20 words, I've only stopped it at 9, which indicates that class A did not recall all 20 words anyway. So they've only recalled a maximum of maybe 9 out of 20. Again, might be a confusing way. So maybe it's actually better for you guys to just draw both groups together, like what I did in the previous slide. Was that a little easier to understand?
Yeah, but Miss, what if we didn't put the numbers and then the bar?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Just ignore the numbers. That wasn't necessary. In fact, there should be something here in the assessor's report that says the numbers were not important. Let me just see. It was not necessary to provide a scale on the y-axis, okay, to get full marks. So it was not necessary. So you don't need to include the numbers. The numbers are what we refer to as the scale. You don't need to include those numbers there. Okay, so if we think about the graph that we did on the previous slide, looking at class A and class B, okay, class A being the maintenance rehearsal and class B being the elaborative. Okay, as long as you can just label that in terms of the two classes and what type of rehearsal they went through. And as long as you can draw the maintenance one as being a lot bigger than the class A, because remember we said as long as you can draw the elaborative one, class B, as being taller or bigger than class A, this shows us that elaborative rehearsal does lead to better recall as per the conclusion that was given compared to a maintenance rehearsal. And you just need to label this as like percentage recall or something like that, or recall of words. That's it. You don't need to include numbers.
You reckon we could get it? Like, because it hasn't came in for like 3 years now. You reckon we could get it?
Yeah, it's possible. Yeah. Look, when you think about it, it's not that hard. Even if this is stuffing up your brain in the exam, just do what you can. It's only out of 2 marks. It's not a make or break situation. So try your best. If worst comes to worst, just do what the bare minimum. Just label the X and Y axes, draw a guesstimation or an estimation of what you think the bars will look like, and just leave it at that and move on. Don't like waste like a good 20 minutes on a 2-mark question. It's not worth it. Okay, see, if you drew something like this, even though it doesn't have a scale on the or numbers on the y-axis there, it's still good. This will get you the 2 marks automatically. And this is what most students that year did as well. They drew either a double bar graph comparing the two or a single bar graph. Now that I look at it, it's probably easier for you guys to draw both, because then it's easier for you to show the comparison between the maintenance and the elaborative. So probably stick to this approach if you get a similar question this year. Yeah. So this option that I've just drawn here, guys, is the 3rd dot point that Vika have put, where they say that some students drew a bar graph for each of the groups, and they showed that maintenance rehearsal showed lower recall than elaborative rehearsal. And we can see that here because this maintenance rehearsal bar is shorter than the elaborative rehearsal bar. So class A's bar or percentage of recall is a lot shorter than class B. Okay, so that's the basic idea. So that's just the different ways that you can approach a graph question, knowing that there's never really any like situation where it's like, oh, we're only going to accept this answer. Vika are quite open when it comes to graph questions. As long as what you've done is mathematically correct and it reflects back in the actual results, then that's really all that matters. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions, guys, about this specific graph question? So far, from what I've seen, Vika have not included a really big, like 5 or 6 mark graph question. They can't really, because you can't really assess. It's not a maths exam at the end of the day. So you can only really assess like basic drawing of graphs when it comes to psychology. Especially if they don't give you a whole lot of data there in the scenario, there's not really much they can expect. So just be prepared for the basics. Just know that you've got to label your x-axis. So whenever you get any graph question, just remember the 3 things of labeling the x-axis. Okay, and remember there's a difference between labeling and scale. Labeling is naming. So this is the name, order in which list words were presented. That's the name or the label of the axis. Okay. The difference between a label and a scale is that the scale is the actual numerical thing. So how you basically list out the numbers. So 2, 3, 4, like that. Okay. Label your x-axis with a name, label your y-axis with a name, and just draw your graph. Okay, that's about it. Draw your graph in accordance to what information you've been given in the scenario. Those are the main things you need to remember when drawing graphs, if you were given a graph question in the exam.
Can we do some content?
No content today. Only research related thing, because this is what helps us learn. We have to go through the past exams. Plus, I have one more question. If you guys want, we can cover some content on Friday in our live session. So just gather your content there. Okay, we're going to do one more sample question from 2019 Vika, and then we're going to wrap it up for today. So this is from a more recent exam, which is the 2019, basically looking at again another research scenario, but in this case they've given us the graph, they've given us the data, so phew, we don't have to draw another one for this question, but we will have to maybe interpret this or use this when we're writing up a conclusion. So I'll just read through the scenario quickly. So year 12 student Steph was concerned about the possible adverse impacts that staying up late to study might have on the ability of drivers who are on their learner permit or probationary driver license to accurately perceive visual stimuli while driving. So she's basically looking at some variables there. She's looking at, staying up late to study. So basically the effect of sleep on, ability to accurately perceive visual stimuli or to see hazards on the road, for example, while driving. To investigate this, Steph conducted research as described below. So she's kind of given us a quick excerpt of her research report there. So the participants, 20 people over the age of 18 from Steph's school community, volunteered to participate. So what type of sampling are we using here, guys? When someone volunteers, we say that's automatically what type of sampling?
Volunteering.
No, what type of sampling procedure?
I don't know. It sounds a bit like convenience because it's
Yeah,
the school community.
It is convenience. It is convenience. That's correct. So whenever it's volunteering, it's always convenience. Just remember that, okay? Whenever you see the word volunteered, but obviously read the scenario properly as well. Don't just see the word volunteered and then say, yep, convenience, but read the rest of the sentence as well, just so you don't mix things up. Anyway, most of the time, if it says that participants are volunteering, that is convenience sampling. Okay, so the method, what was the kind of procedure that took place? Day one, participants experienced 1 night of natural sleep, so their normal sleep patterns, and completed a computer-based visual perception test. So similar to maybe like a hazard test or something at 9 a.m. the following morning. The test involved identifying 30 letters of varying sizes displayed for brief periods. Day 2, participants were required to sleep for only 4 hours in total. So this is kind of the sleep deprivation condition, you could say, because they're not allowed to sleep their natural sleep or normal sleep pattern. They're only sleeping for 4 hours. So 4 hours in total over a 24-hour period. And then they completed a similar computer-based visual perception test. So the same test at 9 a.m. the following morning. So you can see the clear differences between the two groups is that in the condition 1 or on day 1, participants experience natural sleep. And on day 2, participants are sleep deprived, only experiencing 4 hours of sleep. And you can see the results were recorded and collated as the mean percentage of letters accurately identified by participants under each set of conditions. Okay, so now the question A is just worth 1 mark. What would be an appropriate label? Remember I said label is the name that we give to the axis, not the scale, not the numbers, not these. We're talking about the name that we give to that axis. So what would be an appropriate label for the vertical axis of figure 1? Now, what do we mean by vertical axis? Are we referring to the x-axis, guys, or the y-axis?
Why?
Yes, the y-axis. So what do you guys think is the y-axis? What's the label? Look at the scenario again. Particularly look under the information under results and tell me what do you think we could put as a label here? So if I...
Is it visual stimuli?
It's related to that, but that's not the specific label that we can include. What's the label that I would need to include here? So I'm going to draw a box for my label first thing.
Percentage, mean percentage. Of letters accurately identified by the participants.
Yes, you don't need to include the whole sentence, but yeah, mean percentage of letters accurately identified. So that would be my label that goes there. Okay, that is basically why we've got 60, 80, 100. This is representing the mean percentage of recall, 20%. Okay, so if we look at the natural sleep people, they were the ones who had their normal sleep patterns and they went to the testing condition the next day and did the visual perception test. They've got a high level of recall, almost close to 90% or 85% there. Okay, whereas the people who had the 4 hours of sleep understandably have lower level of recall there because they haven't slept enough. They have some cognitive effects there on their functioning. So the 4 hours of sleep participants appear to only have about 65%.
That's me, miss, right now.
Okay, so 85 and 65, yeah? So that's basically showing you that when you're sleep deprived, you have lower mean percentage of recall. So literally all you're going to write here is mean percentage of letters accurately identified on the visual perception test, or even just accurately identified. That's your 1 mark, automatically done for you. Okay, I'll show you guys the assessor's report for this question. So you can see for such an easy question, what was the average mark? 0.4. So why did students lose so many marks on this question? Okay, students lost so many marks on this question because a lot of students might not have known what was meant by the word label. They might not have been able to understand what the vertical axis is, or they might have labeled the y-axis as being like sleep deprivation or given it a wrong label. Okay, so you were only given 1 mark if you were able to say that it was the mean. Remember, mean. Okay, that it was the percentage that was the measurement. Okay, this is not 80 centimeters, for example, this is 80%. Okay, and of letters accurately identified. Okay, so those were the 3 things, or the 3 main aspects that you needed to include in order to get the full mark there. Okay, get the full mark of 1. Some students, what they did was that they actually just wrote percentage of letters correctly recalled, okay, without mentioning mean. So they totally forgot about mean. They wrote percentage of letters that were correctly identified. That automatically gets 0. If you don't include one of these 3 aspects, you will get a 0 out of 1. Okay, and in an exam situation, sometimes you miss it. Sometimes you're quickly reading through and you don't read the word mean. You just read percentage of letters and you write that there. But that would lead to you getting 0. So you always need to properly read the question, highlight important bits there so you don't miss out. Okay, that was for that question there. All right, so let's go to the next part of this question now. Okay, so the last part of this question, last thing we're doing for today is we're looking at a conclusion. So I want you guys to maybe just spend about 1 or 2 minutes now, write a conclusion for this research. What can we say? Remember, guys, that
It's 3 marks for a conclusion.
yeah, but that doesn't mean you have to write a lot. It's not about quantity, it's about what you include. So remember that in a
Not even
conclusion,
in English, mister, they don't even give us 3 marks for conclusion. Come on.
no, you need to just include the correct things. So remember, in a conclusion, guys, I'll just write down what you need to include. We always need to make reference to the sample of or participants. So which participants were used in our study. You need to include a mention of the IV and the DV. And you need to indicate the relationship or the direction of effect between them. So how does the IV affect the DV in this study? So remember, we saw a sample conclusion in the previous scenario with the words. Remember, it said that it was concluded that participants in class B elaborative rehearsal showed better recall compared to the maintenance rehearsal condition. That's a conclusion. So write something similar, take that information and write something similar for Steph's study in this scenario. And when you're done, just put your answer in the chat box and I'll have a look. When we're talking about the relationship between IV and DV, we're talking about the direction of effect. So is one variable increasing the other? Is it leading to a decrease? What's happening there? And remember, even though I'm going to show you guys what an example answer that Vika expected, like there are multiple ways that you could write a conclusion and still get the same mark. Okay, so conclusions are always very subjective, depends on your ability to form that sentence, depends on how you word the sentence. So as long as the 3 things that are included here are mentioned in your conclusion, you will get the 3 marks. It doesn't always have to be so fancily worded or something like that, okay? We can keep it simple and still get the 3 marks. And I'll show you the sample answer, guys, that reflects that. It's a very simple answer, but it got the full marks. And remember, this formula or these 3 things that I've included, we actually looked at this when we marked your research posters as well, whether you guys included the sample, whether you included the IV and DV, whether you included the relationship between the IV and DV as well. So we did look at that. And whenever Vika asks you to write a conclusion in the exam, you must make reference to these 3 things. That's why conclusions are almost always worth 3 marks, because there are 3 things that Vika are looking for in those questions. Good, getting some good answers in the chat. That's good to see. All right, what I'll do is I'll just show you guys the sample answer now. Okay, again, just showing you first the average mark. Conclusions across the board, they're not just difficult for some of us, they're difficult for basically most of the state. As you can see, the average mark for this question was 1.1 out of 3. Okay, a lot of students either did not attempt this question at all, meaning that they got a 0. Okay, 1 mark was awarded for each of the following, which basically I've written up above here, but basically you needed to include the sample. You needed to indicate the direction of the results. So basically whether things are increasing or decreasing, reducing, what's happening basically. And then you need to indicate the relationship between the IV and the DV, which is basically stating the IV and the DV correctly as they relate to the scenario. So this is one of the sample answers. Vika gave many sample answers for this question, but some of them were a bit too complicated or complex, which weren't as obvious. I just wanted to stick to the obvious one because look, you don't get extra marks for trying to be too complex or complicated. Just write the simple answer that gets you the 3 marks and move on. So this was one example of an answer that I thought was very clear. She's written that Steph can conclude that adults, so that was the sample, or you could even write people over the age of 18. Those were both acceptable samples there. Okay, people over the age of 18 can be called adults as well, who experienced a natural night of sleep, performed more accurately on a test of visual perception, or who had increased performance on a test of visual perception compared to participants who only had 4 hours of sleep. So that's it. That's the conclusion. Okay, you've clearly mentioned the sample. You've clearly mentioned the direction of effect. You said performed more accurately. You could have also used words like increased performance. You could have used words like higher accuracy on the mean percentage of letters recalled, whatever. You could have used any similar word there. On a test of visual perception, then when they only had 4 hours of sleep. So you're comparing this with the other condition there. Okay, obviously when we write a conclusion, we do need to take into consideration both conditions that are in that study. Okay, so that's literally it. You get 3 marks there automatically. That's a nice and simple conclusion, but 3 marks are kind of in your bag there with this answer. Okay.
Miss Farouin,
Yeah.
would you have a chance to discuss question 3?
Question, is that from another exam or is that from what we're doing now?
2019 exam.
Is that one of the questions? Is that the research methods question we're doing now, or is that a different note? That's question.
It's not going to do with research methods. It's
okay.
got to do with
Juhan, do you think it would be
conditioning.
okay if we can do it on Friday? Because remember, I dedicated Friday for any extra exam questions you guys had. Just because,
All right, no worries.
yeah, I'll definitely cover that on Friday. Yeah, so I'll put it into a PowerPoint. So it's 2019 question 3. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, the classical conditioning. Okay, I'll definitely put that into a PowerPoint and we'll cover
And the ABC, like the things.
yeah, so just question 3, the whole thing, or just one part of it?
No, both of them.
Okay. We'll cover that on Friday for sure. Okay. Along with any other things. So yeah, that's basically the conclusion. Let me just quickly get some feedback here. Okay, so that's the conclusion. So just keep it simple. Just, you know, if you want, before you start writing your conclusion, you can do a quick plan, or you can write these 3 steps on the side just to make sure you don't forget to include them. Okay, that's basically all it is. So yeah, you can see, not just because it's worth 3 marks doesn't mean you have to write an essay there. Okay, so don't be intimidated.
Do they cut marks for like writing a lot?
Do they cut marks for writing a lot? Look, as long as you can write a clear answer, the more clear the answer is, the better it is. Sometimes students write a lot of waffle, which means that they write a lot, but it doesn't make sense. With your answer though, it was a bit long, but it still made sense. So you would still get the 3 marks there.
I don't understand when you said relationship between the IV and DV. Do you mean like how to compare it like afterwards?
Yeah, so basically when we say relationship between IV and DV, we're saying how does the IV affect the DV? That's what we're talking about. So like if I said, you know, having a natural night of sleep would lead to higher percentage of words that are recalled, or higher percentage of letters that are accurately identified. So I'm indicating a relationship between the IV, which is the sleep amount, and the DV, which is the percentage of letters accurately identified. So just talking about how the IV affects the DV, that's about it. Okay, and we use words like increase, decrease to describe that direction of effect. Okay, guys, are there any questions about this conclusion question that we just did?
No, thank you so much, Miss Fedwin. Honestly, it was so helpful.
Okay, no stress, all good. Okay, guys, these are some of the, like what we went through today is basically most of the questions that I thought were kind of challenging, like research methods wise from previous years from the exams. You can see that they're not as difficult as they look at first glance once you actually read through the scenario and start annotating it. Okay, so just try to continue doing your practice exams, and if you come across any other difficult questions, you can just email me. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to stop the recording here.